Well, welcome to the Richard Oglesby Mansion. We're happy to have you here. This building was built in 1873, finished the next year at a cost of about $15,000. Governor Oglesby and his second wife, Emma, moved into this with their children. This is the hallway, and you're looking at the north door here. And this is the door probably that Ulysses S. Grant walked through in 1880 to visit the Oglesbys and to attend the GAR meeting that was being held that weekend. The GAR was a Grand Army of the Republic, organization of Union veterans that was very powerful politically. When Grant came in, he probably noticed the floor. Just as you can see here, it's oak and maple, and we have this flooring in this hallway and also in the dining room that we'll talk in later. The artifacts that you see in this room that belong to the Oglesbys include the hall tree with hats on it. One of the top hats belonged to Richard Oglesby, and the woman's hat with the black veil belonged to Emma Oglesby. After her husband died in 1899, she stayed in mourning until her death. So the hall tree is original to the house, as is the mantle. At the mantle, you'll notice two electric lights here. Of course, the Oglesbys didn't have electric lights, but there were two gas lights here, and when the house was refurbished, they found the gas light pipe plugs and rewired them for electricity. In the gas pipes that came in here, the restorers found corks that had been used to block them. We're going to walk down the aisle, the rest of the hallway here, and I want to show you some photographs. Here on the wall you see a photograph of the mansion as it appeared about the time that the Oglesbys left in the early 1880s. They lived here from 1873 to 1882, and then they moved to Lincoln, and the house was sold to the Baring family, who was a famous industrialist and inventor here in the area. This is the door here on the north that you came in. This is our refurbished porch, and you'll notice there used to be a circular drive here and a sidewalk. The street was not paved, it was gravel. So I imagine it's pretty dusty here a lot. One of the things that we have available for people to purchase is a biography of Richard Oglesby, and if you're interested, we have them here in this hallway mirror setting available for purchase. Okay, we just walked into the parlor that the Oglesbys had from the hallway, and there's quite a few interesting artifacts in here that contemporary Americans probably don't know too much about. We have the original portrait of Oglesby that we think this used to hang in the governor's mansion, and the family donated it to the mansion. And this lovely mantle that you see below it that's over the fireplace is a replica based on a photograph that we have of the parlor that a local artisan built for us, and there's no difference in this mantle and the one that we can see in the photograph. When Mr. Baring bought the house, he kept pretty much the same for many years, and in the 1880s he took photographs of many of the rooms in the house, and so that's why we had a pretty good idea of what that was in the house and how it looked. The wallpaper is not original to the house. However, it's based on what would be typically found in an 1880 house. And everything we have in this house is based around 1880, since that was the year that the Grants visited the Oglesbys, and we set it around that time frame. Over in the corner we have a photograph of Oglesby in his later years. That's in his Grand Army of the Republic uniform. And that Oglesby's family donated that to us. Also above the fireplace was gas lights. And when we remodeled, we refurbished the house, we weren't able to electrify that area, so those are covered up. When the Barings married into the Evans family, and then the Evanses lived here, they converted this parlor into an apartment, and the apartment had a bedroom and a sitting room and a bathroom in it. And over here where you see the fireplace, that was where the bathroom was. And when we refurbished the house and had to take out, we decided to take out all the apartment. That's why we have carpeting on the floor. The original floor is no longer here, and we made it more like the parlor that the Oglesbys would have enjoyed. The chandelier that we have in the center of the ceiling is original to the house. The Oglesbys had this chandelier. When we bought the house, when the Conservation District bought the house from the Evans family, this chandelier had been moved over to the dining room, a room we'll go into later, and the refurbishing committee decided to move it back in here. And so this is the original chandelier, except for one of the globes. And so when you come and visit us, you see if you can find which globe is the replacement globe. Here at the fireplace, you have an iron cover over the front of the fireplace, and that was put in place during the summer months when the fireplace wasn't going to be used. I suppose they put it there to keep animals from coming down the chimney, and then when the colder months came, they would remove it and go store it. So that's what that iron is. Now, a typical parlor of the 1870s and 1880s would have been jam-packed with stuff. It would have made most of us pretty nervous to be in this room. All the walls would be covered with paintings and photographs, and everything that had a flat surface would have a statue or a fern or a shell or a feather or something on it. The rooms were just crammed with interesting objects of art. We don't do that because, first of all, it would drive us nuts trying to dust it all, and secondly, we just don't have that much for it. On the wall over here, we have a rather famous lithograph of the President signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, Mrs. Oglesby wouldn't have had something like that hanging in the parlor, even if it had been available at the time. This is after their era. Somebody donated this to us, and we put it there to symbolize the Oglesby's closeness to Abraham Lincoln, and that's why this picture is here. Governor Oglesby is not in the picture. As we come through the room, one of the most obvious artifacts that draws people's attention is this harp here, which would not have been in the house when the Oglesbys lived here. It was donated to us by Oglesby descendants, and the harp belonged to Oglesby's daughter, Felicity. And she did play the harp and an organ. And in their other house in Elkhart, they did have a music room, and he would accompany her sometimes on his fiddle. He was quite a pretty good fiddle player from what we hear. Separating the two rooms that we're in, we have a pocket door here that's still functional. Now, the first thing I noticed when I walked into this room, which we call the library, was, of course, the floor. The floor is made up of colored pieces of wood, and that is called a parquet floor because it's made up of many little pieces. And somebody counted, and there's 3,000 pieces of wood that make up this design you see on the floor. Very pretty and intricate. On the ceiling, it's a very beautiful, interesting ceiling. I hope you can see it in person someday. We have the original ceiling. It's what the Oglesbys saw. In fact, this room, which we call the library, is the most originally preserved room in the house. And we know that because of the photographs that Mr. Baring took. Here, in the ceiling, hanging from the ceiling, is an original chandelier from the house. The globes are replacements, but the rest of the chandelier was cleaned up and is still the same as it was when the Oglesbys lived here, except it's been wired for electricity. Other objects in the room that might be of interest are in the display cases. Several of Emma's objects in this lighted display case belong to her, given to us by the family. And you see several fans, and she had collected fans in a little way, and we have some of those. These feather-like objects you see in the back were decorations for women's hair, and many, many millions of birds sacrificed their lives for fashion in that era. Here in the corner of the shelf, you'll see a tiny white toy doll of some sort. Looks like it's made out of maybe porcelain. And that was found not too many years ago underneath the porch. We restored the east porch, and that was found lying in the dirt. And we can only assume that some children were playing underneath the porch, and that got left there, and that workman gave it to us. Over here in this bookcase, you'll see several of Oglesby's books that came to us from his house in Elkhart. The family donated. One of my favorite objects in the house is this book. Out of nowhere, somebody from Virginia sent us this book. They had found in a garage sale out on the East Coast, and going through it, they had found the Oglesby's signature. I don't know if it can be seen on a camera, but that's Oglesby's signature. He actually would have had this book in this house during his lifetime. He also signed the back. And so that just came out of nowhere one day, and the board of directors was delighted to receive it. Every object you see in this house comes from the 1880 era, and it wouldn't have been unusual if you had visited the Oglesbys for you to see these types of objects here. Over here we have a desk. This came from the Illinois House of Representatives, and that's Oglesby's desk that he used when he was in that house. Over here on the other side of the room, we have a desk that looks very similar to it, and this we think came from, we were told it came from the governor's mansion. Apparently you get to take some of the furniture with you when you leave. On the wall here above the desk, you'll see portraits of the Oglesby children by his second wife, Emma. This is the girl who had the harp, and that's Felicity. And you see a group of children here. So judging from the youngest one, I would say this photo probably was taken in the mid to late 1880s. And you can see they're dressed up like sailors, just like your typical Illinois child would be. No, there's no sailors here. This is John over here saluting the public. Beautiful fireplace, original mantel, original mirror. The tiles here are fascinating. They're original to the room. In this display case, one of our famous artifacts is this wooden leg here. And the family story is that it's a souvenir from the Mexican-American War, and it was a wooden leg that had belonged to Santa Anna. The story is that during the Battle of Buena Vista, the Battle of Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna had to flee the battlefield so quickly that he left behind his carriage, and in the carriage was his roast chicken dinner, which the soldiers probably took care of, and a chest of $30,000 in silver, and his wooden leg. And he had different kinds of wooden legs, and this is supposedly one of them. It was found in the Oglesby Mansion in Elkhart when that mansion was getting ready to be torn down, and we were allowed to go and take a look at it. Other artifacts are found in the display case from the Grand Army of the Republic and some of his experiences in the American Civil War. Oglesby fought in 2 wars. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He volunteered as soon as it started and was with the 4th Illinois Regiment, Infantry Regiment, and served at Cerro Gordo and Buena Vista and fought in those battles, and was a lieutenant who was in charge of logistics for that regiment. During the American Civil War, he immediately joined in 1861 and formed a company and became a regimental commander. And he was sent down to Cairo, Illinois, with a group of rather unruly soldiers, and his job was to protect the Union supply base at Cairo. And while he was sitting in his office down there, a stranger walked in and said, "Could he borrow a piece of paper and a pen?" And Governor Oglesby said, "Well, okay." He was a pretty nice fellow. And the stranger wrote out on the piece of paper, "I am hereby taking command of this position." And it was Ulysses S. Grant, whom at that point had never met Oglesby. So that was their first beginning of their friendship. And later on, Oglesby served under him at Fort Donelson, and later on with him near Corinth. Oglesby was wounded in the lung at Battle of Corinth, and people didn't survive lung wounds in those days. But his first wife, Anna, came down and got him and put him in a rocking chair, and they took him to a train car, and they nailed the rocking chair to the floor so he could sit in a comfortable position. And she brought the colonel back to Illinois, where he recovered. He went back to active service with his regiment shortly after that, but it was a little bit too hard for him he was probably still recovering from the wound, and he asked to resign. But first of all, General Grant didn't want him to resign, and Abraham Lincoln didn't want him to resign, and asked Oglesby to come to Washington City and serve as a capacity on a jury there. And while he was in Washington City, he became familiar with the area and the way the government worked. In '64, Lincoln asked Oglesby if he wouldn't come back to Illinois and run for governor. So in 1864, Oglesby did exactly that, and that was the first time that he was elected as governor of Illinois, and served for 4 years. Then he had a period of time off, and then he was re-elected the governor of Illinois for a second time. He served about a week, and then he was appointed to the Senate. In those days, the state government made the appointments of senators, and he became a senator, and so that was his second time he was elected as governor. Then 4 to 8 years after that, he was re-elected for a third time and served his third term, all 4 years of that. So he was governor of Illinois 3 times. And unusually, he didn't, even though he was a governor 3 times in Illinois, he never went to prison. So that's Oglesby's war experience. He was an interesting fellow. When gold was discovered in California right after the Mexican-American War, Oglesby and 7 other Decatur fellows took off for California gold fields, and they made it in a record amount of time. They were there in 90 days. And they were very fortunate. They found lots of gold, and he had about $5,000 worth. And he put it in stored it in his tent, and one of San Francisco's fires swept through and destroyed his gold. So he had to start over again. And they went out and they found another fortune, a small fortune. And so this time he put it in the bank, and the bank folded and he lost all his investment. The third time, so he went out into the gold fields, and this time he sold supplies, and he made quite a bit of money, around $5,000, he said. And he managed to get that back to Illinois, and he did come back to Illinois and started investing in land, and he even freed one of the slaves from his family's past, and became pretty well known and an influential figure. In around 1858, he married his first wife, Anna, and they had 4 children, 2 of them who died rather young. And Anna passed away in 1868 of tuberculosis, and the 2 children and she are buried up in Greenwood Cemetery. You can find the family area up there. After about 4 years, Oglesby met his second wife, Emma Gillette Keyes, who was living in Lincoln, Illinois at that time. And they married, and between the 2 of them, they had 4 more children. And Emma brought a son to the marriage. She was a widow. So that was some of his family experiences. I'm going to take you into the butler's pantry now, and you can take a look at some of the artifacts we have. The woodwork in this room is original to the house, and we use this to store plates and linens for meetings that we sometimes cater to here. You'll see on the shelf over here, Emma's cookbook. She has recipes in there, a few handwritten recipes, and that box that belonged to her. And these came to us from their home in Elkhart. One of the odd things on the top of the cabinet, you'll look up here, is called a lard press. You see the large iron object with the crank handle. I have no idea what a lard press was, but I suppose it involved lard, and it must have pressed something. But when I looked it up online, all I could find was lard presses for sale. It didn't say what they were. So that belonged to the Oglesbys, though I doubt if Emma ever pressed any lard, having she grew up rich. The cabinets, as I said, were original. Now these cabinets don't look too useful, do they? And if you look carefully, you say you couldn't get much more than maybe a teacup in there. But take a look at the inside. See how it recesses into the wall. Pretty clever use of space, I thought. And we call this the butler's pantry. There used to be a house next to this one, that Oglesby's original house. And when he and Emma decided it was getting too small and they needed a bigger place, they had this built right next to it. And they connected the two, and they used the old house for cooking and for servants' quarters. And they were connected by a passageway, we think, in the dining room. And that house that was next door, around 1900 or so, it got moved to someplace else in Decatur, and we have never been able to find out where the original house went. At the time that this was built, that was the only building on this entire side of the block from this street to that street. And then when they connected the two, the Oglesbys owned all of this. Of course, eventually it was sold off in lots. This is a call box. It came from Ogleshurst, which is the Oglesby's Elkhart place. And it has Mrs. Oglesby's and Miss Felicity's name on there as Hiram, who is Mrs. Oglesby's first child. So it's a call box, and it didn't belong in this house. And it was salvaged from the old house in Elkhart, and it was too neat to do anything else, so we put it in the kitchen. I'm going to take you into the parlor. The Restoration Committee really had some fun with this room. You can see the wallpaper on the wall, and that is an exact copy of wallpaper Oglesby's had here, down to and including the color. Now the reason we know that was that Right here between the fireplace and this door, there was a wall that subsequent owners had built across and made this probably into a little butler's pantry to have their food served. And the original restorers decided to remove the wall, and behind the 2x4s that made up the wall, they found scraps of the original wallpaper. They sent it to a wallpaper company in California called Bradbury and Bradbury, and they could take the scraps of wallpaper and make exact copies of it, which are not inexpensive. And so we have the original type wallpaper here. The ceiling is the original color. We found that underneath. The whole room had been painted white, including the woodwork, and that all had to be redone. Along the east wall here, you'll see what looks like wood paneling. And if you were standing here with me, I would talk about the wood paneling here, and then I'd tell you to touch it. And when you touch it, you'll see that it's paper. It's painted paper. And apparently for a while, in that era, rich people would have fake wood painted onto the walls as if it were wood. And that's supposed to look like maple and oak. But it's paper, and it's really well done. We had a local artist do that for us. The table is not original to the house. It came from a Western Military Academy down near St. Louis. The fireplace is original. The mantle is original. We found that up in the attic when we refurbished the house. The chandelier is not original. It was found practically stripped in an antique store, and it was purchased, and we had an idea of what the prisms looked like, and over quite a long period of time, it was redone, and that's the type of chandelier that would have been in the house in that era. One interesting piece of furniture a lot of people don't know about is called a petticoat table or petticoat mirror. And if you look underneath the table down here, you can see a mirror. Guys are getting that on the camera. And supposedly, ladies would always be quite worried that their petticoats were showing underneath their dresses. And they would come in and look at the petticoat mirror and make sure that their slips weren't showing. And so that's why it's called that. Whether they actually did that or not, I don't know. Here we have a really nifty storage cabinet that's put in the house, though, after the Oglesbys left. So it's not original to the house. But we can see we can use it for storage of items that we don't need right away. This is original to the Oglesbys, and the story that the family gave us is that it was presented to Governor Oglesby by people from his original regiment from the Union Army. And the candlestick holder is original to the Oglesbys also. Nice little window alcove. These used to be gas lights, but we have, of course, changed them to electricity. On this corner cabinet, we have a huge collection of dinnerware, and it was donated to us by a local citizen. And we set those out often for, when we have the open houses, so people can see what a aristocratic person would set their table as. There's salt cellars and soup tureens and platters and all sorts of different gizmos that we don't use anymore. So that's the room, and I hope you enjoyed our little tour of it. These drapes are original copies. I should say authentic copies. I'm going to take you now to the staircase, and it goes up to our second floor. There is a basement here, but as far as we know, Oglesby's never used it for something special. There had been some letters written about it being a bowling alley, but we don't have any idea that they ever put in a bowling alley downstairs. In those days, everything was not mechanical. The house, when it was designed in 1868, it was designed to have a furnace, coal-burning furnace, and running water, and a toilet somewhere in the house. And so it was a pretty advanced design for that era. It was designed by Jenny out of Chicago, who had been a Civil War engineer and probably met Oglesby in Grant's headquarters at the time. Now this staircase is a beautiful example of that. And we have in the corner over here what's called a coffin corner. And it has a statue in it. And the supposed use of a coffin corner was when you brought a coffin down the stairs or something, big heavy piece of furniture, you would have a little bit room to swing it around. Whether it was actually served that purpose, I would question. But nevertheless, we have this as an original part of the house. And I suspect that the statue might be original since the Evanses had left it here. Well, we're on the top of the steps, we call the landing, and immediately to my left we have two photographs of Oglesby's two wives. This is Anna, who passed away in 1868 of TB, and this is the second wife, Emma Gillette Keys Oglesby. This area, we suspect that Emma may have used this for an office or a planning area as she ran the household and dealt with correspondence. The knitting that you can see on the couch or the seat over here is her knitting, and it's supposedly the last knitting she worked on before she had a stroke in 1927. On the wall you see a couple photographs of women. The center larger photograph is Emma in her later years. Since she's all in mourning black, it would have had to be after 1899 probably. And then we have a young Emma on the left there with a rather fancy light colored gown. And I think that's Olive or Felicity you can see on the right. You notice the old type of frame. In later years, when the Barings and Evanses owned the house, they put in an elevator. And people are always interested in our elevator, and this is the door over here that you would use. And the elevator goes down to where the front door was, and it's not usable now for safety reasons. And it was used so that people could come up and go into Mr. Baring's, Mr. Evans's office, which he had on this floor. We'll walk into what we call the master bedroom. Now, one of the tricky things about restoring this house is that nobody made any records anywhere that we're aware of how the Oglesbys used their rooms in the house. And so we had to assume that the biggest one would be the master bedroom, and there was some commentary and some letters concerning a children's room and a nursery. There are three rooms that are you don't have access to up here, and we have a residence apartment that are just in front of me that is off limits to our guests. I'm going into the master bedroom now. The clothing you see came to us from the family from Ogleshurst. And there's some rather strange pieces of clothing here. I think that this was something a woman would wear to keep warm on her shoulders while she, I don't know, read in bed or knitted. The bed looks pretty tiny, doesn't it? It's a typical sized bed for us. It's headboard and the footboard so overwhelm it, it really makes it look smaller than it actually is. And we've had people measure it with tape measures to satisfy their curiosity. Okay, the dresses you'll see upstairs belong to the family. And you can see how tiny the family was. Over here on this nightstand, we have some artifacts that most people don't know about. This one is to store hair in. For when you brushed your hair, you would save the strands that would come out and put them through that hole there. And eventually accumulate enough of them to use them to stuff pen cushions. And maybe some of you know about the pen cushions, and you use human hair because of the traces of oils in it would keep the pens and needles from rusting. We have here a certificate of thanks from the Columbian Exposition. That was a huge world expo that was in 1893 in Chicago, and Emma was congratulated for the job she did on her knitting. She was a famous knitter, I guess. Okay, we have a toilet here. I don't think the Oglesbys would have used it if they had running water, but this is a nice artifact. And you can hide it, and you can figure out whose job it was to empty it every morning. Children are usually pretty fascinated by that story. I always like to tell the story of chamber pots. Now again, I don't think the Oglesbys would have had a chamber pot, but it wouldn't be an unusual thing to see in 1880 Decatur. And you can see one of the examples of a chamber pot in the corner that somebody donated to us. Now one of the interesting chamber pot stories, I think, is that during the American Civil War in the South, people who manufactured chamber pots would put a picture of General Ben Butler on the bottom. Now he was a very hated Union general who captured New Orleans, and the Confederates hated him so much they put a price on his head, which he didn't seem to bother him any. And so people could, when they went to the bathroom, they could always think of General Butler. And you'd have the servants empty that every day, or the kids. So this is the master bedroom. We're going to walk across the hallway now and go into what we call the children's room. Here we have a mannequin with a original Emma dress on it. And if you were able to see it closely, you would just see there's several kinds of material that is used to make this up. And of course the stitches would have been hand stitched, and they are just tiny. This is a work of art, and it's really fortunate that we are able to have it and display it. So this belonged to Emma. When the Oglesbys lived here, their children were ranged in ages from 15 down to 3. And so they would have had a playroom, I suppose, and we call this the playroom, and another chamber pot. Children guests are always, that's the most interesting thing in a room for children guests. We have some period toys here for people to notice, and the children don't know what a bird cage is. We like to show them the bird cage in the window archive. Now, you'll notice that this house does not have very many closets, and that's the way houses were built of that era. Closets sometimes could cost a homeowner extra money in taxes, or they just didn't have so many clothes that they needed closets. And so we do have a wardrobe over here that we use to store period clothing in and costumes. And again, we have pocket doors. And as you walk into this room, the first thing I noticed was the wardrobe over here with some assorted dresses in it that came from Oglehurst. And this gown has an interesting story to it. You can see on the wall the photograph of Emma, and that's her with her new gown that she was going to wear to one of the governor's balls. And one of the descendants of the Oglesbys had that photograph, and she took it to a tailor and had an exact replica made of it and wore it to a function. Now, I don't know if this is original ermine. That would probably drive the cost up pretty high, but it looks just like the dress in the photograph. Another small person, kind of envy the sizes. We have Governor Oglesby's formal wear here, hanging on a hanger. Always hang on a hanger your clothes that you're preserving. And then one of Emma's morning dresses. We don't know whether she had them made here or would go to Chicago or New York or Philadelphia to have dresses tailored. We call this room the boardroom, and it might have been a nursery. We used it for board meetings for quite a few years and then moved those downstairs. We just kind of have a collection of different artifacts up here. In this display case, to me, the most interesting artifact is the Red Cross clothing there. Felicity did volunteer work with the Red Cross during World War I, and they got together and they rolled bandages and wrote letters, I suppose, and everybody had to have a uniform, and that was hers. And they were quite proud of their activity and support of the war. We have a facsimile of a letter from Robert Lincoln, who's Abraham Lincoln's oldest son, the last surviving child. And this is a letter asking Oglesby, for heaven's sakes, do not let Robert be nominated to run for president. He did not want to run as a Republican candidate for president. And he was asking Oglesby to make sure that didn't happen. He was a pretty prominent politician and businessman in that era. Over here, we have a photograph of, a drawing of Lincoln's death room over at the boarding house where he was taken when he was wounded. And Oglesby was present when Lincoln died. Now, Oglesby had gone to Washington, D.C. for state business in 1865, and he stopped by to visit his old friend, and they had a nice conversation, and Abraham Lincoln asked Oglesby if he wouldn't like to go to the theater with him that night with his wife, Mary. And Oglesby was just exhausted from his trip. I think he probably was still recovering from the wounds and didn't have the strength, he said, to go. So Lincoln found somebody else, and he and Mary attended the theater, and of course that was the night Lincoln was murdered. Oglesby said he spent many times in his life wondering if he couldn't have done something if he had gone to prevent the assassination, but of course that's just nightmares that people have. So Oglesby was called to Lincoln's area, and he was present when Lincoln passed away. In the display case, there's a pile of rocks on a shelf. And one of the things that shows it to me that Oglesby had a sharp, keen, inquiring mind was that as he would be traveling around the country, he would see an interesting rock and he'd pick it up and bring it home for a collection. So we have a few of his rocks from his collection. He would take things like a pebble from the Grand Pyramid or a pebble from famous monuments that he would visit. Back in the 1850s, after he'd gotten back from California, he decided to take a tour of Europe and the Holy Land and visited many of the rulers there, including Queen Victoria. And he went through Ireland and England and Austria and France and Italy, Russia. And then he went down across the sea down to the Holy Land and visited the pyramids and the sites that are mentioned in the Bible. And I can't imagine a citizen taking a rock from the Great Pyramid to bring home today. One of the interesting local photographs we have here, and I don't know how well it'll photograph. This is taken from the porch of the Oglesby Mansion, and it's looking just northeast a little bit of a parade that was going by, taken by Mr. Baring. So this would have been probably in the late 1880s. Oglesby had been an early member of the Decatur chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, And I don't think he founded it. He would go to the meetings occasionally. And in the center of the room, we have the table that came from the local Grand Army of the Republic office and 3 of their chairs. So this is an artifact that would have a lot of interest to a political junkie or a soldier, a veteran. I mentioned to you down in the library when we were talking about the items in the display case about how women wore feathers in their hair as part of the decoration. And we have a photograph here of one of Emma's sisters being presented to Queen Victoria at the turn of the century. And this is an example of the dress that she would have worn to do that, and the feathers in her hair decoration. Well, thank you for joining us here at the Richard James Oglesby Mansion in Decatur, Illinois. If you would like to visit us, be sure to check our website at oglesbymansion.org and check out what our hours are and our location in this city. We'd like to have you visit us and get a chance to talk with our docents about the General Oglesby and his life here in Decatur and as a servant of the United States. We enjoyed having you. This is Bill Horton saying, come again.